Hello everyone, this is Dr. Geri Puleo, and I'd like to welcome you to this mini webinar on burnout recovery, what really works to overcome burnout. Now, as many of you know, I've done extensive research on what causes and maintains burnout in employees who have undergone transformational organizational change. However, what I discovered is not just relevant to people burning out because their company is undergoing change. What I've found is that the BDOC model, or burnout during organizational change model, applies in a variety of burnout producing situations. But most importantly for today's webinar, what I discovered by interviewing my participants was that there were basically 9 different paths that they took in order to recover from their burnout. Now, some of these paths aren't going to be too surprising to you. They're pretty common. Exercise. Everyone who's stressed out has been told, make sure you get out and exercise, because what does it do? It releases the endorphins that make you feel better. And to be honest, about 43% of my participants actually used exercise to help them recover from their feelings of stress and burnout. The numbers were very similar whether you're a man or whether you're a woman. Roughly about 50% of men and 40% of the women used exercise to de-stress. This exercise didn't have to be marathon running. It didn't have to be several hours a day. Basically, just walking and light exercise was very good at relieving their feelings of burnout. Another way to combat burnout that you're not going to be surprised by is the fact that burned out workers tend to utilize their support network by helping them to reframe the issues, contributing to their burnout, and help them to develop new ways to move forward. Interestingly, I thought that almost everybody would use support networks. But what I discovered in my own study is only about 57%, or a little over half, relied on their support networks to overcome their feelings of burnout. Another one that's related to the support network goes into something more formal in terms of support, which would be actual therapy. Now, what was really interesting with this is even though the burned out workers had companies who had EAPs, or employee assistance programs, only about 14% actually used the therapy services through the EAP to help them overcome their burnout. And even more interesting, this was primarily women, and none of the men I studied went to therapy to try to overcome their burnout. Now, that said, exercise, a support network, and therapy are pretty common ways to avoid burnout. But what I think is most interesting are these not so common ways that my participants use to overcome burnout. The first one, we don't like this too much, but legal action. Legal action was taken when the company's actions were so egregious that the employees felt that it contributed to their burnout, which led to other problems in the workplace. Thankfully, only about 21% used legal action. Something that is more proactive would be learning how to better delegate. But again, this really wasn't used by a lot of my burned out workers to overcome these feelings. Only about 14% overall. But what I think is really telling, despite the superwoman complex that many women in the workplace succumb to, 80% of the women delegated to help them overcome their feelings of being stressed, overworked, and overburdened. In marked contrast, only about a quarter of the men delegated to help them overcome their feelings of burnout. Now, this next uncommon way to combat burnout is probably really going to surprise you. If you were burned out because you felt overwhelmed by the changes that your company was going through, some participants, about half, 50%, overcame their feelings of burnout by focusing on other changes. Some went to school, some focused more on their families, but they took their focus off the stressor that was causing their burnout, about 50%. So if you're burned out, maybe what you want to do is, instead of wallowing in the feelings, look outside yourself for something to take your mind off the stress-producing situation. That can also lead into embracing the changes. Now, as I said, my research focused on burnout during organizational change, but a lot of people tend to burn out because of the changes that they're experiencing in their lives. And when they can make that shift in perception, and if you've been following my blog, you know that I believe that perception is reality. By embracing the changes, it helped considerably for them to overcome their feelings of burnout. Overall, this worked for about 29% of the people that I interviewed, and this worked for about half the men, but about 20% of the women had a difficult time embracing the changes in order to overcome those feelings. What was really important was that about 43%, or a little less than half, engaged in self-reflection. In other words, instead of focusing on other changes or focusing outside themselves, they looked into themselves to try to understand what exactly was going on that contributed to their feelings of burnout. Now, that was only 8 ways to overcome and recover from burnout. So what exactly is the number one way to recover from burnout? Physical or psychological removal. To give you an idea how prevalent this was, every one of the men whom I interviewed, and 90% of the women, either physically or psychologically removed themselves from whatever was causing them their stress. Now, some of these removals were false cures. In my previous webinar on the false cures of burnout, we talked about them. It can be some type of an escapist activity, such as drinking, drug usage, even the work itself. Any type of escapist activity is a way to get over the burnout. But you really don't want to use the false cures because they don't put you in a good psychological space that you can move forward and out of the burnout. What's more proactive is to physically remove yourself from the situation if it's generated by your organization, by either requesting an internal transfer, get away from the people or situations that are really causing you the stress. This is kind of a win-win for both you and the employer, because the employer doesn't lose a good employee, and you don't have to go through the whole big job search and onboarding of going with another company. However, a lot of the people whom I interviewed actually left their organizations, well over 90%. And many of them actually left their industries. In other words, they felt that a major career change, remember how I said before that some of the ways to overcome burnout during organizational change is to focus on other changes? Many of them left their industries altogether. And by doing that, they really removed themselves from what was causing them their burnout. So how exactly do you leave burnout behind? Well, if you look at the BDOC model, the second half of it, after you're burned out, the physical or psychological removal is usually the first way that people who are burned out attempt to get out of these feelings of stress and burnout. Once you remove yourself from that stressful situation, then it becomes a lot more easy to engage in the self-reflection, engage in the proactive activities that lead to self-knowledge and acceptance of where you are. Once you can accept where you are, it becomes much easier to more clearly think of ways to come out of that burnout situation. But what's interesting is that You know you've overcome burnout and left it behind when your psychological contract with your employer or the stressor has changed. A psychological contract is basically those unwritten rules governing what is expected of you and what you will give in return. When you have that psychological contract, you are effectively changing the landscape of how you perceive things, of how you um, identify what is stressful and what isn't. And then by doing that, you can actually leave burnout behind. So, what's the takeaway of this? There's a lot of different ways that you can overcome your feelings of burnout. Whatever you do, you need to eventually distance yourself from that situation in order to more clearly develop an action plan to move forward.